I'm Emma Taylor, 29, a pediatric nurse here in Denver, and 18 months ago I lost the most important person in my life, my mother Rebecca. She left me something irreplaceable, a jewelry collection she'd spent 20 years building, each piece holding memories of our life together. But last week, when I went to visit her collection like I do every month, I found an empty jewelry box and a note from my stepfather David saying he'd sold everything to buy his 17-year-old daughter Chloe a brand new BMW convertible. $85,000 worth of my mother's legacy, gone to spoil a teenager who barely knew my mom existed. He told me I should be grateful he kept the empty box for me as a memento. What would you do if someone erased your last connection to the parent you lost? Let me know in the comments as I take you through this journey of betrayal, investigation, and the justice I fought tooth and nail to achieve. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning air in Denver carried that crisp autumn chill that always reminded me of Mom. She used to say October was when the mountains showed off their best colors, and she wasn't wrong. I pulled into the driveway of the Lakewood house where David Mitchell, my stepfather, lived with his daughter Chloe. The same house where my mother Rebecca had spent her final years, the same house where her jewelry collection waited for my monthly visit. It was a ritual I'd maintained religiously since her death 18 months ago. The third Sunday of every month, I'd drive out from my Capitol Hill apartment to spend time with the pieces that connected me to her memory. The house looked different somehow, though I couldn't put my finger on exactly what had changed. Maybe it was the way the morning shadows fell across the front yard, or maybe it was the gleaming BMW convertible sitting in the driveway where David's old sedan usually parked. The car was pristine white with red leather interior, the kind of vehicle that screamed expensive. I wondered if David had finally gotten that promotion he'd been chasing at the insurance company, though it seemed like quite a leap from his usual practical choices. I used my key to let myself in, something David had insisted on after Mom died. "You're still family," he'd said, pressing the spare key into my palm at the funeral. "This house has your mother's presence in it. You should be able to visit whenever you need to feel close to her." At the time, his words had meant everything to me. David had always been kind, if a bit distant, during the 4 years he was married to Mom. He wasn't my father, that man had walked out when I was 12, but he'd made Mom happy in her final years, and that had been enough for me. The house felt eerily quiet as I climbed the stairs to the master bedroom. Usually, I could hear Chloe's music thumping from her room, or David puttering around in his home office, but today silence filled every corner. I pushed open the bedroom door, my heart already lifting in anticipation of seeing Mom's collection. The antique cedar jewelry box sat on the dresser exactly where it always did, its rich wood gleaming in the morning light. Mom had bought that box at a flea market in Boulder when she first started designing jewelry, back when I was in middle school. She'd refinished it herself, sanding away years of neglect until the grain showed through like silk. But when I lifted the lid, my world tilted sideways. Empty, completely, utterly empty. The velvet-lined compartments that usually held Mom's life work. Her custom rings, the vintage brooches she'd collected, the emerald necklace she wore on special occasions, contained nothing but shadows. My hands shook as I opened every drawer, every hidden compartment, desperately searching for some sign that this was a mistake, that maybe David had moved the collection somewhere for safekeeping. Instead, I found a note tucked into the main compartment, written in David's careful handwriting on his insurance company letterhead. "Emma, I sold Rebecca's jewelry collection to give Chloe a proper start in her senior year. The BMW will serve her much better than old jewelry sitting unused. I kept the box for you since it has sentimental value." She would have wanted Chloe to have opportunities. David, I read the note 3 times before the words fully registered. Sold. He'd sold Mom's collection. The pieces she'd created with her own hands, the vintage items she'd hunted for at estate sales across Colorado, the family heirlooms passed down from her mother. All of it gone to buy a car for a 17-year-old girl who'd barely spoken to my mother during her illness. My legs felt weak, and I sank onto Mom's old reading chair in the corner. The chair where she used to sit every morning, sketching new designs for her jewelry while drinking her coffee. I could almost smell her perfume in the fabric, that light floral scent she'd worn every day of my life. My chest tightened as memories flooded back, Mom showing me how to polish silver when I was 8, teaching me to identify real pearls versus fakes, explaining the difference between white gold and platinum. She'd planned to teach me everything about the jewelry business, hoping I might join her someday after nursing school. "These aren't just accessories, Emma," she'd told me during one of our last conversations before the cancer took her. "Every piece tells a story." The sapphire earrings are from the first custom order I ever completed. The garnet bracelet was your grandmother's wedding gift. That Art Deco brooch came from the estate of a woman who traveled the world in the 1920s. When I'm gone, they'll be your connection to all of us who came before. Now that connection was driving around Denver in the form of a teenager's luxury car. I stood up abruptly, my grief transforming into something harder, more focused. This wasn't just theft, it was the erasure of my family history. David had no right to make that decision. No right to decide what my mother would have wanted when she'd explicitly told me the collection was meant for me. I pulled out my phone and called David immediately. The phone rang 4 times before going to voicemail, his professional insurance agent greeting playing in my ear. "David, it's Emma. I'm at the house. Call me back immediately. We need to talk about Mom's jewelry." I tried to keep my voice steady, but I could hear the tremor of rage underneath. Next, I tried calling Chloe, though I doubted she'd answer. We'd never been close. She was 13 when David married Mom, already set in her ways and resentful of the intrusion into her father-daughter dynamic. During Mom's illness, Chloe had been polite but distant, visiting occasionally but always seeming uncomfortable in our family space. I couldn't blame her entirely. Blended families were complicated even under the best circumstances, and a terminal illness had made everything more intense. Chloe's phone went straight to voicemail too. I left a message, trying to sound calm. "Chloe, it's Emma. I need to talk to you and your dad about something important. Please call me back." What I really wanted to say was much less diplomatic, but I knew burning bridges wouldn't help me get Mom's jewelry back. I spent another hour in the house, searching through drawers and closets, hoping against hope that David had simply moved the collection somewhere safe. In Mom's old jewelry workspace in the basement, now converted into Chloe's gaming room, with multiple monitors and LED lights. I found nothing. Her tools were gone, her sketches cleared out, even the small safe where she kept her most valuable pieces had been emptied. It was as if she'd never existed.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
In this space at all. The reality hit me as I stood in what used to be Mom's creative sanctuary. David hadn't just sold her jewelry, he'd systematically erased her presence from the house. The workshop conversion, the missing photographs that used to line the hallway, even the kitchen herbs Mom had loved were gone, replaced by Chloe's energy drinks and processed snacks. This had been planned, deliberate, complete. I drove back to my Capitol Hill apartment in a daze, the empty jewelry box sitting in my passenger seat like an accusation. My small one-bedroom place suddenly felt like a refuge after the hostile territory of David's house. I'd moved here after finishing nursing school, choosing the location partly because it was close to Denver General where I worked, but mostly because the tree-lined streets and old Victorian houses reminded me of the neighborhood where Mom and I had lived before her remarriage. That evening, David finally returned my call. His voice was carefully neutral, the same tone he used with difficult insurance clients. "Emma, I got your message. I assume you found my note about the jewelry. You sold Mom's collection, I said, not bothering with pleasantries. $85,000 worth of jewelry pshole, that was meant for me, sold to buy Chloe a car she doesn't need. Now Emma, let's be reasonable about this. David said, his tone shifting into the patronizing register I was beginning to recognize. That jewelry was just sitting there, doing nobody any good. Chloe needs reliable transportation for her senior year, college visits, her job interviews. Your mother always said education and opportunities were the most important gifts we could give young people. My mother said the jewelry collection was for me. I shot back. She told me explicitly, multiple times, that it would be my inheritance. You had no right to sell it. David sighed heavily, the sound of a patient man dealing with an unreasonable request. Emma, I understand you're upset, but legally, as Rebecca's widower, I inherited all her personal property. I've been generous letting you visit the collection all these months, but I needed to make practical decisions about unused assets. Chloe is my responsibility now, and that BMW will serve her for years to come. The casual dismissal of my mother's life work as unused assets made my blood boil. These weren't stocks or bonds or abstract investments. They were pieces of art, family heirlooms, the physical manifestation of Mom's creativity and passion. Each ring, each necklace, each pair of earrings had been chosen or created with love and intention. Now they were reduced to a line item in David's financial planning. Where did you sell them? I asked, trying to keep my voice level. Which store? I don't see how that's relevant. David replied, the transaction is complete, Emma. I think it's time you focused on moving forward instead of dwelling in the past. Your mother wouldn't want you to be stuck in grief over material possessions. The conversation ended there, with David hanging up before I could respond. I sat in my kitchen, staring at my phone, realizing that the man who'd comforted me at Mom's funeral, who'd promised to keep her memory alive, had decided that memory was worth exactly the price of a luxury car for his teenage daughter. But I wasn't going to let this stand. Mom had worked too hard, loved too deeply, created too beautifully for her legacy to become someone else's convenience. David thought he could hide behind legal technicalities and manipulative psychology, but he'd made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated how far I was willing to go to honor my mother's memory. This wasn't just about jewelry anymore. This was about respect, justice, and making sure that the people who take advantage of grief learn there are consequences for their actions. The next morning, I called in sick to work for the first time in over a year. I had research to do, calls to make, and a plan to formulate. David Mitchell was about to discover that stealing from a grieving daughter was the biggest mistake of his comfortable, calculating life. I hadn't always been the type of person who fought back. Growing up in Boulder with just Mom and me after Dad disappeared when I was 12, I'd learned to keep my head down and work hard for everything I wanted. When other kids were getting allowances and new clothes for school, I was babysitting neighborhood children and saving every dollar in a mason jar under my bed. Mom worked 2 jobs back then, mornings at a local jewelry repair shop and evenings cleaning office buildings, just to keep our small apartment and put food on the table. But even during those lean years, Mom never lost sight of her dream. Every weekend she'd take me to estate sales and flea markets across Colorado, hunting for vintage jewelry pieces or unique stones she could incorporate into her designs. I remember being 13 and embarrassed that we spent our Saturdays digging through other people's cast-offs while my classmates went to the mall. What I didn't understand then was that Mom was building something extraordinary, piece by piece, weekend by weekend. The jewelry collection that David had so callously sold wasn't just valuable because of its monetary worth. It represented 20 years of Mom's artistic vision, her eye for beauty, and her ability to see potential where others saw junk. That Art Deco brooch David had reduced to cash for Chloe's car had been discovered at a garage sale in Manitou Springs, tarnished black and missing half its stones. Mom spent 3 months researching its origins, finding replacement stones that matched the period and restoring it to museum quality. The woman who sold it to her had no idea it was designed by a famous 1920s artist who'd created pieces for Hollywood stars. Every piece in that collection had a similar story. The Victorian mourning locket came from an antique dealer in Georgetown who thought it was worthless costume jewelry. Mom recognized the craftsmanship, researched the hallmarks, and discovered it was made by a renowned British goldsmith in 1887. She'd shown me the original documentation she found, explaining how mourning jewelry was a way for people to honor their deceased loved ones with tangible beauty. The irony wasn't lost on me now that David had sold that very piece, meant to honor the dead, to buy his living daughter a luxury vehicle. As a pediatric nurse at Denver General, I'd built my career on being the calm presence in crisis situations. When parents brought their children to our emergency department, scared and desperate, I was the one who could explain complex medical procedures in simple terms while keeping everyone focused on positive outcomes. My colleagues often commented on my ability to de-escalate tense situations and find solutions even when everything seemed hopeless. But sitting in my apartment that Monday morning, staring at Mom's empty jewelry box, I felt anything but calm. The nursing profession had taught me to be meticulous about documentation, to gather all the facts before making any major decisions, and to always have a backup plan when lives were on the line. These skills had served me well in the hospital, but now I realized they would serve me even better in getting justice for what David had done. If he thought he could manipulate a grieving daughter with smooth words and legal technicalities, he was about to discover that he'd seriously underestimated the woman Mom had raised me to become. I spent that morning creating a detailed inventory of every piece I could remember from Mom's collection. The emerald necklace she'd worn to her wedding with David Hastam, designed with stones she'd personally selected from a dealer in New Mexico. The pearl bracelet that had belonged to my grandmother, passed down through 3 generations of women in our family. The turquoise ring Mom had made for herself after her first big sale, a celebration of finally earning enough from her jewelry business to quit one of her 2 jobs. Each entry in my inventory included not just a description of the piece, but its estimated value, its personal significance, and any documentation I could remember Mom showing me. The insurance appraisal from 2 years ago had valued the entire collection at $85,000, but I knew some individual pieces were worth much more than their assessed amounts. The Art Deco brooch alone had been appraised at $12,000, and that was before Mom had it professionally restored. By noon, I had filled 8 pages with detailed descriptions, and I was only halfway through what I could remember. The magnitude of what David had stolen began to sink in as I wrote. This wasn't just a grieving widower making a questionable decision about unused assets. This was the systematic liquidation of an artist's life work, converted into cash for his daughter's convenience without any consideration for the true owner's wishes or rights. I decided to start my investigation at the source. David's note had been maddeningly vague about where he'd sold the collection, but Denver's jewelry market wasn't unlimited. There were maybe a dozen shops in the metro area that dealt in vintage and custom pieces at the level of quality Mom had collected. I made a list of every jewelry store, pawn shop, and estate dealer I could find online, planning to visit each one until I found where David had taken Mom's pieces. My first stop was Rocky Mountain Jewelry Exchange in Cherry Creek, an upscale district where I figured David would go to get the best prices. The shop specialized in estate jewelry and custom pieces, exactly the kind of place that would appreciate Mom's collection. The owner, Amanda Foster, was a woman in her 50s with an expert eye for quality and a reputation for fair dealing. Mom had actually sold a few pieces through Amanda over the years when she needed quick cash for materials or equipment. Amanda recognized me immediately when I walked in. "Emma, honey, I was so sorry to hear about your mother's passing. Rebecca was one of the most talented designers I ever worked with. That woman could see beauty in pieces other people would throw away." Her genuine warmth was a stark contrast to David's cold dismissal of Mom's work as unused assets. Thank you, Amanda. Actually, I'm here because I need to ask you about Mom's collection. Did someone bring her pieces in here recently to sell? I tried to keep my voice casual, but Amanda's expression immediately shifted to concern. Oh, sweetheart, she said softly. Your stepfather was here last week. He brought in almost the entire collection pieces I'd been admiring for years every time Rebecca showed them to me. I have to be honest, I was surprised he was selling them. Your mother always talked about how much those pieces meant to you, how she was saving them for your future. My heart started pounding, but I forced myself to stay focused. Do you remember which pieces he brought in? And what you paid for them? Amanda hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Emma, I hope you don't mind me asking, but did you know he was selling them? Because when he brought them in, he seemed nervous, kept checking his phone, and insisted on cash payment instead of a check. Usually when people inherit jewelry collections, they take their time deciding what to sell, maybe keep a few special pieces. Your stepfather acted like he wanted to complete the transaction as quickly as possible. The picture Amanda painted confirmed my worst suspicions. David hadn't made a thoughtful decision about unused assets. He'd conducted a fire sale of stolen property, desperate to convert Mom's jewelry into cash before anyone could stop him. I didn't know, I admitted. I just found out yesterday when I went to visit the collection. Can you tell me what you bought and for how much? Amanda pulled out a thick ledger book and flipped to a recent entry. I purchased 15 pieces for $32,000. I would have paid more, but your stepfather insisted he needed the money immediately and was willing to accept below market value for a quick sale. Some of those pieces were worth twice what I paid for them individually. $32,000, just from one shop. David's note had mentioned using the money for Chloe's BMW, which probably cost around $60,000 new. That meant he'd sold Mom's collection to multiple dealers, spreading out the transactions to get the cash he needed. The calculated nature of his betrayal made me physically sick. Amanda, this is important, I said, leaning forward. I need to know exactly which pieces you bought, and I need any documentation of the sale. My mother left that collection to me, and David had no right to sell it. Amanda's face grew serious. Emma, are you saying those pieces were stolen? Because if that's the case, I need to protect my business, but I also want to do right by your mother's memory. Let me get the detailed receipt and photos I took for my records. While Amanda gathered the paperwork, I felt a mixture of hope and dread. Hope, because I'd found concrete evidence of David's theft, but dread because I was beginning to understand the scope of what he'd done. If he'd sold 15 pieces to Amanda for $32,000 and needed at least $60,000 total for Chloe's car, he'd probably hit multiple shops across Denver. Mom's collection had been scattered across the city like pieces of a shattered mirror. Amanda returned with a folder containing detailed photos and descriptions of every piece David had sold to her. Seeing Mom's jewelry documented like evidence in a criminal case made the whole situation feel surreal. The turquoise ring Mom had made to celebrate her first big sale was listed as Southwestern-style custom ring, sterling silver and genuine turquoise, circa 2010, purchased for $800. $800 for a piece that had represented Mom's breakthrough as an artist, reduced to a line item in a transaction ledger. Amanda, I need to ask you a favor, I said, looking up from the painful documentation. I'm going to fight this legally. David forged ahead with this sale without my knowledge or consent, and I believe my mother's will specifically left this collection to me. Would you be willing to testify about the circumstances of the sale if it comes to that? Amanda nodded immediately. Absolutely. Your mother was a good friend and a brilliant artist. If someone stole her life's work and sold it without permission, that's not just theft, it's desecration of her memory. I'll do whatever I can to help you get justice. I left Rocky Mountain Jewelry Exchange with photocopies of all Amanda's documentation and a renewed sense of purpose. David had made a crucial mistake by conducting his theft so hastily and obviously. Amanda's observations about his nervous behavior, his insistence on cash payment, and his willingness to accept below-market prices painted a picture of someone who knew exactly what he was doing wrong. My next stop was Heritage Antiques and Jewelry in downtown Denver, another shop that specialized in estate pieces. The owner, Robert Chen, was less friendly than Amanda but equally professional. When I asked about recent jewelry purchases, he consulted his computer records and confirmed that a man matching David's description had sold him 8 pieces the previous week. Paid him $18,000 for the lot, Robert said matter-of-factly, good pieces, but he seemed eager to sell quickly. Didn't haggle on price like most people do. Usually that means either someone needs cash fast for an emergency or they don't really know what they're selling. $18,000. Combined with Amanda's $32,000, that brought the total to $50,000, and David still hadn't reached the full cost of Chloe's BMW. I was beginning to realize that Mom's collection had been worth significantly more than the $85,000 insurance appraisal. When you factored in appreciation over the past 2 years, plus the pieces Mom had added since the last appraisal, David had probably stolen well over $100,000 worth of jewelry. Robert showed me photos of the pieces he'd purchased, and my heart broke seeing more of Mom's treasures reduced to inventory items. The Victorian mourning locket I'd mentioned in my mental inventory was there, listed for $400 despite being worth at least $3,000 based on its age, craftsmanship, and historical significance. David's ignorance about the collection's true value meant he'd sold priceless pieces for a fraction of their worth, but from my perspective, every dollar was still stolen money. By the end of that first day of investigation, I'd visited 6 jewelry stores and confirmed sales at 4 of them. The pattern was consistent at every location pieced. David had appeared nervous, insisted on cash payment, accepted below-market prices, and completed transactions as quickly as possible. Several shop owners commented that his behavior seemed odd for someone who had legitimately inherited the pieces. I drove home that evening with a folder full of documentation, photographs, and witness statements that painted a clear picture of David's systematic theft. But I also realized that recovering Mom's jewelry was going to be more complicated than I'd initially hoped. The pieces were now scattered across multiple dealers, some of whom had probably already resold them to private collectors. Even if I could prove the jewelry was stolen, and force the shops to return what they still had, tracking down pieces that had been resold would be nearly impossible. That night, I called my best friend from college, Jake Williams, who'd gone to law school at the University of Denver and now practiced estate and family law. Jake and I had stayed close over the years, partly because he'd loved Mom like a second mother during our college days. She'd always invited him for holiday dinners when he couldn't afford to fly home to Oregon, and he'd spent countless hours in her jewelry workshop, fascinated by her creative process. "Emma? I'm so sorry," Jake said when I finished explaining the situation. "I can't believe David would do something like that. Your mom always talked about how much that collection meant to you, how it was going to be your inheritance and connection to her artistic legacy." "Jake, I need to know what my legal options are," I said. "I have documentation of the sales, witnesses who can testify about David's suspicious behavior, and I'm pretty sure I can prove that Mom intended the collection to come to me. Can I get the jewelry back or at least force David to compensate me for its full value?" Jake was quiet for a moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the legal complexities. "It depends on a few factors," he finally said. "First, we need to see what your mother's will actually says about the jewelry collection. If it's specifically bequeathed to you, then David committed theft regardless of his status as widower. Second, we need to determine whether the jewelry was considered separate property or marital property under Colorado law. Since your mother owned most of it before marrying David, there's a strong argument that it remained her separate property to dispose of as she wished." The mention of Mom's will made my stomach clench. I'd been avoiding thinking about the legal documents partly because the reading had been so painful, but also because I'd trusted David's assurances that everything would be handled according to Mom's wishes. Now I realized that trust had been catastrophically misplaced. I have a copy of the will in my apartment, I told Jake. Mom gave me a copy when she was first diagnosed, said she wanted me to understand how everything would be handled after she was gone. I remember there being specific language about the jewelry, but I haven't looked at it since the funeral. Get that will, Jake said firmly. If your mother specifically left the jewelry collection to you, then every sale David made was theft, plain and simple. We can force him to return the pieces that haven't been resold yet, and sue him for the full replacement value of everything else. This could be a significant financial judgment, Emma. We're talking about potentially over $100,000 in damages, plus legal fees and punitive damages for the emotional distress he's caused. The idea that I might actually be able to get justice for David's betrayal filled me with a determination I hadn't felt since Mom's death. For 18 months, I'd been drifting through life, focusing on work and trying to process my grief while maintaining some semblance of normal relationships with David and Chloe. I'd convinced myself that keeping peace was what Mom would have wanted, that family harmony mattered more than my own feelings about being marginalized. But this wasn't about family harmony anymore. This was about theft, betrayal, and the systematic erasure of my mother's artistic legacy. David had gambled that I would be too grief-stricken or too polite to fight back, that I would accept his patronizing explanations and move on with my life. He'd calculated wrong. The woman Mom had raised me to become was stronger than my grief, smarter than his manipulations, and absolutely unwilling to let him profit from stealing my inheritance. I spent the rest of that evening locating Mom's will and reading through its provisions with new eyes. The language regarding the jewelry collection was crystal clear and left no room for David's self-serving interpretation. I leave my entire jewelry collection, including all pieces in my possession at the time of my death, all tools and equipment related to jewelry creation, and all precious stones and metals in my workshop, to my beloved daughter Emma Taylor, as a token of our shared love of beautiful things, and as the foundation for her own creative endeavors, should she choose to pursue them. Mom hadn't just left me the jewelry, she'd left me her tools, her materials, and her workshop, envisioning a future where I might follow in her artistic footsteps. David had not only stolen my inheritance, he'd stolen the possibility of continuing Mom's creative legacy. The workshop conversion to Chloe's gaming room now seemed like a deliberate act of destruction, erasing any trace of Mom's artistic life to make room for his daughter's entertainment. But David had made one crucial error in his calculations. He'd assumed that grief would make me weak, that I would be too overwhelmed by loss to fight for what was rightfully mine. Instead, his betrayal had given me something I'd been lacking since Mom's death, a clear sense of purpose and the righteous anger needed to pursue justice no matter what it cost him. The morning after reviewing Mom's will with Jake, I woke up with a clarity of purpose that had eluded me since her death. I'd spent 18 months moving through life in a fog of grief, going through the motions at work, maintaining surface-level relationships with David and Chloe, and telling myself that keeping peace was what Mom would have wanted. But reading her will again, seeing her explicit instructions about the jewelry collection, and her hope that I might continue her artistic legacy, shattered all my carefully constructed rationalizations about family harmony. Mom hadn't written vague language that could be interpreted multiple ways. She'd been specific, detailed, and absolutely clear about her intentions. The jewelry collection was mine, full stop. David's claim that he'd inherited everything as her widower was legally false, and his insistence that Mom would have wanted Chloe to have opportunities was emotionally manipulative nonsense designed to make me feel guilty for defending my own rights. I called in for my scheduled shift at Denver General and requested a week of personal leave. My supervisor, Dr. Patricia Hansen, knew about Mom's recent death and immediately approved the time off. "Take care of yourself, Emma," she said warmly. "We'll manage without you for a few days. Family matters always come first." The irony of her words wasn't lost on me. Family matters were exactly what I was dealing with, just not in the way Dr. Hansen imagined. I wasn't taking time off to grieve or heal. I was taking time off to build an airtight case against my stepfather for theft, fraud, and violation of my mother's explicit testamentary wishes. Jake had given me a list of things we needed to gather before filing any legal action. First and most important was establishing the complete inventory of Mom's jewelry collection. My handwritten list from memory was a good start, but we needed official documentation. Jake suggested I check Mom's homeowner's insurance records, since most people with valuable jewelry collections kept detailed inventories for coverage purposes. I drove to David's house in Lakewood that Tuesday morning, knowing he'd be at his insurance office and Chloe would be at school. Using my key felt different now, less like visiting a family home and more like entering enemy territory to gather intelligence. The house that had seemed merely changed during my last visit now felt actively hostile, as if David's betrayal had poisoned the very air inside. I went straight to the home office where David kept all his paperwork. The room was obsessively organized, which made sense for someone in the insurance business. File cabinets lined one wall, each drawer labeled with careful precision: financial records, medical documents, property information, personal correspondence. I found what I was looking for in the drawer marked estate documents. Mom's insurance file was thick, containing policies for life insurance, health coverage, and a separate rider for her jewelry collection. I pulled out the jewelry inventory and felt my breath catch. Mom had updated it just 6 months before her death, adding photos and detailed descriptions of every significant piece in her collection. The document listed 47 individual items with a total appraised value of $92,000, significantly higher than I'd remembered. Each entry included the item's description, approximate age, materials, purchase or creation date, and estimated value. Mom had also added personal notes about the significance of certain pieces. Next to the emerald necklace she'd worn for her wedding to David, she'd written, "For Emma on her wedding day, whenever that may be." Every bride deserves to wear something that makes her feel beautiful and connected to the women who loved her. I had to stop reading and wipe my eyes. Mom had documented these pieces not just for insurance purposes but as a legacy, a way to speak to me even after she was gone. Every note revealed her intention that this collection would pass to me, that these objects would connect me to our family history and her artistic vision. David had known this, had probably seen these very documents, and had sold the collection anyway. I photographed every page of the inventory with my phone, making sure the images were clear and readable. This documentation would be crucial for proving the collection's value and demonstrating Mom's clear intention that it was meant for me. As I worked, I heard the front door open downstairs. My heart jumped into my throat. David wasn't supposed to be home. I quickly returned the files to their proper places and closed the cabinet drawer, but I wasn't fast enough. David appeared in the office doorway, his expression shifting from surprise to suspicion when he saw me standing by his filing cabinets. "Emma, what are you doing here?" His voice was controlled, but I could hear the edge beneath it. "I didn't know you were coming by today." "I still have a key," I said, keeping my voice steady despite my racing pulse. "I came to look through Mom's things. I'm trying to remember everything that was in her jewelry collection." David's face hardened. "We already discussed this, Emma. The jewelry is sold. Chloe needed the car, and I made an executive decision as Rebecca's widower. It's time to let this go and move forward." Something in his dismissive tone broke through my last restraint. All the anger and hurt I'd been containing since finding the empty jewelry box came flooding out. "You had no right to sell that collection. Mom's will specifically left it to me. Every piece, every tool, everything in her workshop. You stole my inheritance and spent it on a luxury car for your daughter." David's eyes narrowed dangerously. "Stole? That's a serious accusation, Emma. I suggest you be very careful about throwing around words like that. Your mother's will left the jewelry to you, yes, but it also made me the executor of her estate. I had the authority to make decisions about liquidating assets to cover estate expenses and provide for the family." "Estate expenses?" I laughed bitterly. "You mean a BMW for Chloe? That's not an estate expense, David. That's you using my inheritance as a personal piggy bank." Chloe is part of this family, David said, his voice rising. She deserves the same opportunities any child would have. Your mother understood that when she married me, she was taking on responsibility for my daughter as well. She would have wanted Chloe to have what she needed. Mom specifically wrote in her will that the jewelry was for me. I shot back. She added personal notes about giving me the emerald necklace on my wedding day. She documented every piece with the explicit intention that it would stay in our family, connecting me to her memory and her artistic legacy. You knew all of this, and you sold it anyway. David stepped closer, his face flushed with anger. Your mother also trusted me to make good decisions for this family. She knew I would take care of both you and Chloe. If that meant selling some jewelry to give Chloe opportunities, then that's what it meant. You're being incredibly selfish, Emma, focusing on material possessions instead of honoring your mother's memory through generosity and family unity. The gaslighting was so blatant it would have been laughable if it wasn't so infuriating. David was trying to reframe his theft as generosity, my defense of Mom's explicit wishes as selfishness. He was using the language of family and unity to justify betraying the very foundation of what family meant. I'm done with this conversation, I said, moving toward the door. David blocked my path, and for a moment I felt a spike of genuine fear. We were alone in the house, and he was much larger than me. But he stepped aside after a tense moment, though his expression remained cold. If you're thinking about causing trouble over this, I'd reconsider, David said quietly. Legal battles are expensive and time-consuming, and they tear families apart. Your mother wouldn't want that. She'd want you to accept that I made the best decision I could with the information I had. I met his eyes steadily. Mom wanted me to have her jewelry collection. She said so explicitly in her will, in her insurance documents, in conversations we had before she died. You violated her wishes, David. And yes, I am going to cause trouble over it. I'm going to make sure you face consequences for what you did. I walked past him and down the stairs, my hands shaking but my resolve firm. Behind me, I heard David call out, "You're making a huge mistake, Emma. This is going to cost you more than you realize." His words were meant to intimidate me, to make me reconsider fighting back. Instead, they confirmed what I'd already concluded. David knew exactly what he'd done, knew it was wrong, and was now trying to bully me into silence through threats of expensive litigation and family division. But he'd miscalculated badly if he thought I would back down. I drove straight to Jake's law office in downtown Denver, my adrenaline still pumping from the confrontation. Jake took one look at my face and immediately ushered me into his conference room, closing the door behind us. "What happened?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. I told him everything about finding the insurance inventory, the confrontation with David, and his thinly veiled threats about expensive litigation. As I talked, Jake took notes and occasionally asked clarifying questions. When I finished, he sat back in his chair with a grim expression. "Emma, David just made a major mistake," Jake said. "By acknowledging that he knew the will left the jewelry to you but claiming executor authority to sell it anyway, he's essentially confessed to wrongdoing. Colorado estate law is very clear that executors can't override specific bequests in a will. If Rebecca explicitly left the jewelry to you, David had no authority to sell it regardless of his executor status. So we can sue him." I asked, hope and dread mixing in equal measure. "We can absolutely sue him," Jake confirmed. "Based on the insurance inventory you found, we're talking about $92,000 in documented value, possibly more depending on appreciation and pieces that weren't on the inventory. We'll file a civil suit for conversion of property, breach of fiduciary duty as executor, and violation of testamentary intent. We can also seek punitive damages given that his actions were willful and in direct contradiction of explicit instructions." The legal terminology made the situation feel more real and more serious. This wasn't just family drama anymore. This was a legitimate case of theft and fraud that could result in significant financial and potentially criminal consequences for David. "What about the jewelry that's already been sold?" I asked, "Can we get it back?" Jake's expression turned more cautious. "That's complicated. Under Colorado law, if someone purchases stolen property in good faith without knowledge that it was stolen, they can claim what's called a bona fide purchaser defense. However, if we can prove that the dealers had reason to know the jewelry was stolen based on David's suspicious behavior, we might be able to force them to return the pieces or compensate you for their value." I pulled out my phone and showed Jake the photos I'd taken at the various jewelry stores, along with the notes I'd made about each dealer's observations of David's nervous behavior and insistence on immediate cash sales. Jake's eyes lit up as he scrolled through the documentation. "This is excellent work, Emma," he said. "Multiple dealers all reporting the same pattern of suspicious behavior. That creates a strong inference that David knew he was doing something wrong. It also might be enough to overcome the bona fide purchaser defense if we can show the dealers should have been on notice that something wasn't right about the sales." We spent the next 2 hours going through every detail of the case. Jake had me write out a complete timeline of events, from Mom's death 18 months ago to the discovery of the empty jewelry box to my investigations at the various shops. He asked detailed questions about my relationship with David, his relationship with Mom, and any conversations I could remember about the jewelry collection's intended disposition. One memory stood out particularly clearly. About a month before Mom died, when she was still coherent but knew the end was near, we'd been sitting in her bedroom looking through the jewelry collection together. David had come in and suggested that perhaps some of the pieces should be saved for Chloe, so she'd have something to remember Rebecca by. Mom had been firm in her response. "David, I love that you want Chloe to feel connected to our family, but this collection has been built over 20 years of my life and career. It represents my artistic journey, my connection to my own mother and grandmother, and my legacy to Emma. These pieces are going to her when I'm gone, every single one. If Chloe wants jewelry, I'll be happy to teach her about design and help her start her own collection, but this one is Emma's." I'd forgotten that conversation in the chaos of Mom's final weeks and the grief that followed. But now it came back with perfect clarity, and I realized it might be crucial evidence of Mom's intentions. Jake immediately recognized its significance. "That conversation establishes several important things," he explained. "First, it shows Rebecca explicitly rejected David's suggestion to give jewelry to Chloe, making it clear the collection was meant solely for you. Second, it demonstrates that David knew about Rebecca's intentions while she was alive, which means he knowingly violated her wishes after her death. Third, it provides context for why he might have acted so quickly and secretively in selling the jewelry. He knew it wasn't rightfully his to sell." The conversation with Jake lasted until late afternoon. By the time I left his office, we had a solid plan of action. Jake would draft a formal demand letter to David, requiring him to account for every piece of jewelry he'd sold, provide documentation of all sales transactions, and compensate me for the full value of the collection within 30 days. If David refused or failed to respond adequately, we'd file a lawsuit in Jefferson County District Court. "One more thing," Jake said as I was leaving. "I want you to be prepared for this to get ugly. David has already threatened you with expensive litigation. He's going to fight this, probably claim that he acted in good faith as executor, or that the jewelry was community property. He might try to drag your mother's memory through the mud, suggest she was mentally incompetent when she wrote the will, or claim that you're exaggerating the collection's value. None of that will work legally, but it will be emotionally brutal." I nodded, steeling myself for what was coming. "Jake, I've spent 18 months trying to preserve peace with David, because I thought that's what Mom would have wanted. But you know what? Mom also taught me to stand up for myself, to fight for what's right, and to never let anyone diminish my worth. If David wants a war, he's going to get one." That evening I returned to my Capitol Hill apartment and spread out all my documentation on the dining room table. Photos of jewelry from multiple dealers, copies of the insurance inventory, notes from my conversations with shop owners, the relevant passages from Mom's will, and my own handwritten memories of significant pieces and conversations. Looking at the evidence laid out before me, I felt a strange mixture of grief and determination. Each photograph represented not just a piece of jewelry, but a memory of Mom, the turquoise ring she'd made after her first big sale, celebrating finally earning enough to quit her second job, the Victorian mourning locket she'd restored over months of careful research and work, the emerald necklace she'd worn on her wedding day to David, promising me it would be mine when I got married. All of it reduced to transaction records and evidence exhibits in a lawsuit against the man she'd trusted to honor her memory. But this was necessary. Mom had worked too hard, created too beautifully, and loved me too completely for her legacy to be casually erased by someone who valued convenience over conscience. David had gambled that I would be too polite or too grief-stricken to fight back. He'd calculated that family pressure and social expectations would keep me silent. He'd underestimated the strength Mom had instilled in me through years of watching her build something beautiful from nothing, piece by piece, despite every obstacle life threw at us. I pulled out a photo of Mom from my phone, one of my favorites taken about a year before her diagnosis. She was sitting in her workshop surrounded by tools and stones and half-finished pieces, her face lit up with the pure joy of creation. She looked strong, confident, and completely at peace with herself. That was the mother I needed to remember, not the pale shadow she'd become in her final weeks. "I'm going to fight for your legacy, Mom," I said out loud to the empty apartment. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you created, and how much it meant, and I'm going to make David pay for every single piece he stole." My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Emma, this is Chloe. Dad told me you're planning to sue him over some jewelry. Please don't do this. He was just trying to help me, and you're going to destroy our family over money. Your mom would be ashamed of you." The text hit like a physical blow, not because I believed Chloe's assessment of Mom's hypothetical reaction, but because it revealed how thoroughly David had manipulated the situation. He'd positioned himself as the generous father, trying to help his daughter, and me as the greedy villain trying to destroy a family over material possessions. The narrative he was building was designed to isolate me, make me doubt myself, and pressure me into backing down. I typed out several angry responses and deleted them all. Finally, I settled on something simple. "Chloe, your father sold jewelry that my mother explicitly left to me in her will. This isn't about money or destroying families, it's about honoring her wishes and protecting her legacy. I'm sorry you're caught in the middle of this." The response came quickly. "You're just jealous that Dad loves me more than he ever loved you. You were never really part of our family anyway. I hope you lose everything in court." I turned off my phone and sat in the gathering darkness of my apartment, processing the depth of hostility in Chloe's messages. This 17-year-old girl, who'd barely known my mother and had shown minimal interest in her during her illness, was now defending her father's theft with venom and certainty. David had shaped her perception completely, turning a clear case of wrongdoing into a story about family loyalty and my supposed greed. The demand letter arrived at David's insurance office 3 days later, delivered by certified mail, so there would be legal proof of receipt. Jake had crafted it carefully, laying out the facts in clear, unemotional language that left no room for misinterpretation. David Mitchell had sold property that belonged to Emma Taylor, according to the explicit terms of Rebecca Taylor's last will and testament. He had 30 days to provide complete documentation of all sales, account for every piece of jewelry, and arrange full restitution of $92,000 plus interest and legal fees. Failure to comply would result in immediate civil litigation. I'd expected radio silence, or perhaps another round of threatening messages. What I got instead was a phone call from David's brother, Tom Mitchell, less than 12 hours after the letter was delivered. His voice on the phone was gruff and accusatory. "Emma, what the hell do you think you're doing threatening my brother with a lawsuit? David's been nothing but good to you since your mother passed, and now you're repaying his kindness by trying to squeeze money out of him." I took a deep breath, reminding myself that Tom was getting David's version of events, carefully edited to paint me as the villain. "Tom, I'm not trying to squeeze money from anyone. Your brother sold jewelry that my mother explicitly left to me in her will. He had no legal right to sell it, and now I'm asking him to make it right. You're being unreasonable, Tom insisted. That jewelry was just sitting there collecting dust. David made a practical decision to give Chloe something she actually needed. Where's your sense of family responsibility? The manipulation was so similar to David's arguments that I wondered if they'd rehearsed this together. Tom, I'd appreciate it if you'd stay out of this. It's between David and me, and it's going to be resolved either through voluntary restitution or through the courts. I kept my voice calm but firm. You're going to regret this, Tom said, his tone shifting to something darker. Legal battles destroy families, Emma. Do you really want to be responsible for tearing apart what little family you have left? I ended the call without responding further. Tom's threats were empty, designed to intimidate rather than inform. But his involvement revealed that David was mobilizing his family network, building a coalition of people who would pressure me to drop the case. I needed to be prepared for more calls like this, more attempts to paint me as the aggressor rather than the victim. Jake had warned me that this phase of the conflict would be emotionally exhausting. People don't like acknowledging that someone they know and trust could do something genuinely wrong, he'd explained during one of our strategy sessions. So they'll create alternative narratives where you're overreacting, being greedy, or misunderstanding the situation. Your job is to stay focused on the facts and not let them manipulate you into backing down. The facts were my anchor. Mom's will explicitly left the jewelry to me. The insurance inventory documented every piece and its value. Multiple jewelry dealers could testify to David's suspicious behavior during the sales. No amount of family pressure or emotional manipulation could change these fundamental truths. 2 days after Tom's call, I received a letter from David's attorney, Richard Pemberton, a partner at a mid-sized law firm in Denver. The letter was condescending in tone, claiming that David had acted within his authority as executor, and that the jewelry sales were legitimate exercises of his fiduciary responsibilities. Pemberton argued that estate expenses and family obligations sometimes required liquidating assets, and that David had made reasonable decisions in challenging circumstances. The letter concluded with a threat, thinly disguised as legal advice. Miss Taylor should be aware that frivolous litigation can result in sanctions and fee shifting, meaning she could be responsible for paying Mr. Mitchell's legal expenses if her claims are found to be without merit. We strongly advise her to reconsider this course of action before incurring unnecessary legal costs. Jake read Pemberton's letter with obvious disdain. This is textbook intimidation. Pemberton knows David doesn't have a legitimate defense, so he's trying to scare you with threats of sanctions and fee shifting. But Colorado law is absolutely clear on this point. Executors cannot override specific bequests in a will. David had no authority to sell jewelry that Rebecca explicitly left to you. So what do we do now? I asked, feeling the weight of escalating legal maneuvering. We file the lawsuit, Jake said firmly. We've given David 30 days to make this right voluntarily, and instead he's hired an attorney to threaten you. That tells me he has no intention of returning the jewelry or compensating you fairly. It's time to let the courts settle this. The decision to move forward with litigation felt both terrifying and liberating. Terrifying because I was committing to a public legal battle that would expose family dysfunction and potentially cost significant time and money. Liberating because I was finally taking control of the situation instead of reacting to David's manipulations. While Jake worked on the legal documents, I continued my investigation. I expanded my search beyond Denver, visiting estate jewelry dealers in Boulder, Aurora, and Colorado Springs. At a small antique shop in Boulder called Timeless Treasures, I finally found more of Mom's pieces. The owner, Margaret Wilson, remembered David immediately. "Oh yes, that nervous man with the beautiful jewelry," Margaret said when I described David and showed her photos of Mom's collection. "He came in about 3 weeks ago with a bag full of exquisite pieces. I could tell right away they were high quality, the kind of jewelry you don't see often. But something felt off about the whole transaction." Margaret pulled out her records and showed me what she'd purchased. 7 pieces for a total of $15,000, including the sapphire earrings Mom had bought with earnings from her first major custom order. Seeing those earrings reduced to an inventory line item made my throat tight with suppressed anger. What felt off about the transaction? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Margaret leaned forward conspiratorially. Well, for one thing, he kept looking at his watch like he was in a hurry. For another, he didn't know anything about the pieces. When I asked about their provenance or history, he just said they'd been his wife's and he was downsizing. But the way he handled them, with no care or sentimentality, it was like they meant nothing to him. People who are selling beloved items usually have stories about them, memories attached. This man just wanted cash as quickly as possible. I explained the situation to Margaret, showing her Mom's will and the insurance inventory. Her expression shifted from curiosity to anger as she realized she'd unknowingly purchased stolen property. Margaret agreed to provide a written statement and to testify if necessary. She also offered to return the pieces she still had in inventory at cost, though legally she wasn't required to do so. By the end of my expanded investigation, I'd traced approximately $80,000 in jewelry sales across 7 different dealers. The pattern was consistent everywhere. David had appeared nervous and rushed, insisted on cash payment, provided minimal information about the pieces, and completed transactions as quickly as possible. No legitimate seller disposing of inherited jewelry would behave that way. The complaint was filed in Jefferson County District Court on a cold Monday morning in late October. Jake had warned me that once we filed, there would be no turning back. Within hours of the filing, my phone started buzzing with messages from relatives I hadn't heard from in months. David's sister Karen sent a long text about how disappointed she was in me for airing family problems in public. The most painful message came from Patricia, Mom's sister, and my aunt. Patricia had been at Mom's bedside during her final days, had helped plan the funeral, and had promised to stay connected with me after Mom was gone. But her message now was full of reproach and disappointment. "Emma, your mother would be heartbroken to see you doing this. David was good to Rebecca during her illness, and Chloe is just a child caught in the middle of adult conflicts. Can't you find it in your heart to forgive and move on? This lawsuit is going to cause pain for everyone involved, and for what? Money? Things? Your mother raised you better than this." I read Patricia's message 3 times, feeling each word like a physical blow. The suggestion that I was betraying Mom's values by defending her explicit wishes was particularly cruel. I drafted a careful response to Patricia. "Aunt Pat, I understand this looks bad from the outside, but Mom's will explicitly left her jewelry collection to me. David sold it without my knowledge to buy Chloe a luxury car. I've tried to handle this privately, but David refused to make it right. I'm not fighting over money. I'm fighting to honor Mom's wishes and protect her artistic legacy. I wish you could support me in this." Patricia never responded. Her silence spoke volumes about how effectively David had poisoned the family against me, but I couldn't afford to dwell on lost relationships or defend myself to every relative who'd bought David's version of events. I had to stay focused on the legal case and trust that the truth would eventually become clear. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.